We're looking at a captivating profile of a Japanese racehorse named Twin Turbo. And our mission for this deep dive is to really uncover the anatomy of an unlikely legend.
It's such a fascinating case study.
It really is. We are going to explore how a horse with a resume that was honestly mediocre at best somehow became an undeniable icon. For you, the listener, whether you're trying to understand what makes a legacy endure or you're just looking for a new perspective on success, this is essentially a masterclass in how raw emotion and unfiltered commitment can outshine perfection.
It really is a story that forces us to rethink our definitions of greatness. I mean, when we look at history, whether in sports or business or art, we tend to assume that the figures remembered most fondly are the ones who just conquered their world.
Yeah, the dominant champions.
Right. We assume they had flawless records and dominated their competition with undeniable authority. But Twin Turbo challenges everything we assume about what it takes to be remembered. When you examine his career through a calm, analytical lens, you find a trajectory that was anything but calm. It shows us that sometimes being unforgettable has very little to do with being the best on paper.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the facts are remarkably uninspiring when you line them up. Twin Turbo was born on April 13th, 1988. His sire was a horse named Leilage, who was hardly an outstanding stallion himself.
Not at all.
He basically earned his spot in the breeding shed, largely thanks to the success of his sister. And Twin Turbo's dam was Racing Gene.
So when you look at his overall pedigree, there was just nothing that suggested greatness. We are not dealing with racing royalty here. No, he simply wasn't bred to be a superstar. And his actual race record perfectly reflects that fairly ordinary beginning. He managed to secure 3 G3 victories. That's the Sankei Show All-Comers, the Tanabata Show, and the Radio Tampa Show.
Which sounds good, but...
Right, to put that into perspective for the Japanese racing tier system, winning a G3 race makes you a legitimate working professional. It means you are a highly capable athlete. But he was entirely locked out of the G1 tier.
The majors.
Exactly. The G1 races are the major leagues, the massive events where the immortals of the sport cement their legacies and take home the historic trophies. In the grand hierarchy of Japanese racing, his statistical presence was, at best, a sporting character.
Which is a fascinating place to be. Usually those middle-of-the-pack horses just fade from public memory entirely. They're the guys in the background of the movie, not the leading men. And his career trajectory really follows that supporting character arc into a rather quiet downward spiral.
It's actually a bit sad on paper.
It is. He eventually drifted into regional racing, where he only managed to scrape together a single win. When he retired from the track entirely and briefly stood at stud, the demand for him was minimal. Breeders weren't exactly lining up to capture his genetics, and he passed away early from heart failure, leaving almost no descendants behind.
No legacy in the bloodlines.
Exactly. He didn't build a massive bloodline empire. On paper, his story should have quietly faded into the archives.
But here is the paradox that makes this deep dive so compelling. His story didn't fade. If you ask any Japanese racing fan over the age of 30 to name the ultimate runaway horse, Twin Turbo stands shoulder to shoulder in popularity with the most decorated G1 champions in history.
It's wild to think about.
It is. So the central mystery for us to explore and for you to consider as you listen is exactly that. How does a horse with this specific, deeply flawed resume refuse to fade into obscurity? How does a statistical supporting character become a cultural legend?
Well, the answer comes down to his incredibly unique, almost theatrical racing style. He was known as a big escape artist. He was the kind of racer who broke the race open entirely from the very front. And when fans argue over who the greatest frontrunner of all time is, it usually boils down to 2 names.
The big debate.
Right. One is Silent Suzuka, who was an unparalleled powerhouse and an actual G1 winner. And the other is Twin Turbo, who never won a G1 in his life. Statistically, it seems completely unfair to even put them in the same conversation. I mean, in many of the graded races Twin Turbo entered, he finished disastrously. We're talking dead last in some cases.
There's a phenomenal contrast between those 2 horses that explains why they share that pedestal, though. The source material puts it perfectly. Silent Suzuka was precision. Twin Turbo was detonation.
Detonation. I love that word for this. It paints such a vivid picture. Silent Suzuka was this graceful, effortless, perfectly calibrated machine who could just glide ahead of the pack. But Twin Turbo was an all-or-nothing spectacle. From the second the gates open, he would just blast forward at full throttle.
Total maximum effort.
No holding back, no strategic calculation, no saving energy for the final stretch. He would just run at maximum speed until his stamina emptied out.
And the binary nature of that strategy is what made him so mesmerizing. There were only two possible outcomes in a twin-turbo race. It was either a spectacular wire-to-wire victory where he simply outran everyone from start to finish, or it was a catastrophic defeat.
Literally no in between.
None. When his stamina emptied, he would collapse dramatically. Sometimes he'd start fading before the third corner. Other times, he would stagger backward through the field like a rocket that ran out of fuel mid-flight.
Oh man, if you had money on this horse, your heart must have been in your throat for the first 1,500 meters, only to completely sink as you watch him go in reverse on the final turn.
A nightmare for bettors.
A terrible betting strategy, but it makes for incredible television. I mean, picture the Tanabata show. You have a packed stadium, the turf is flying, and this tiny horse just rockets to a 10, maybe 15 length lead. The broadcasters literally had to pan the camera wide just to keep the rest of the pack in the frame.
It's an incredible visual.
The sheer absurdity of it is thrilling. Watching that, you'd think he's this wild punk rock horse flipping the bird to traditional racing strategy, just deciding to run like a maniac because he wants to.
You would think so, but the reality is the exact opposite. He wasn't a rebel, he was terrified.
Wait, terrified? You mean this all-out sprint was essentially a panic response?
Precisely. The deep psychology behind that explosive racing style is rooted in extreme vulnerability. When you dig into his background, you find out he was incredibly timid and sensitive. He was the kind of horse who simply could not function inside a crowded pack.
Wow.
If he got surrounded by other horses, his race would fall apart immediately. He just couldn't handle the physical and psychological pressure of running in the middle of the herd.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He was essentially claustrophobic out there on the track. The proximity of the other horses, the noise, the jostling, it was just too much for him to process.
What's fascinating here is how that extreme sensitivity dictated his entire career. For a horse that is terrified of the pack, there are realistically only two strategic options. You either drop to the very back of the field and trail far behind everyone, or you blast to the very front and lead the pack.
Right, get as far away as possible.
Exactly. And given his specific nature, dropping to the back wasn't going to win him any races. Leading from the front was his only practical choice. This explosive, seemingly crazy racing style wasn't romantic recklessness at all. It was pure survival. He ran that way because he had to, because it was the only possible way he could compete.
That is such a profound shift in perspective. Just think about that for a second. How often do we, as observers, misinterpret someone's sheer desperation to survive as bold, calculated rebellion? We look at twin turbo blasting out of the gates, building this massive, seemingly arrogant lead, and we think, wow, what a maverick, what a brave, fearless competitor.
When really he's just running away.
Yes. In reality, he was just working with the extreme limitations he had. He was terrified of the pack, so he ran away from it as fast as his legs could carry him.
This raises an important question, though, from a purely analytical standpoint. If twin turbo relied entirely on early speed and front running to avoid the pack, why not just shorten the distance of his races?
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. Why did his trainers keep racing him around the 2,000-meter mark? Why not put him in a short sprint where his early speed would be a massive advantage?
Yeah, if stamina is the major issue and he keeps running out of fuel like a rocket mid-flight, the logical move is to just make the flight shorter. Put him in a sprint, let him blast to the front, and cross the finish line before the fuel tank hits zero.
It seems like the obvious solution. But when you break down the realities of racing mechanics, you realize why that would have been a disaster. Sprinters, by definition, are highly explosive out of the gate, and their early pace is blistering. Twin Turbo, despite his runaway style, had two serious limitations that disqualified him from sprinting. First, he was notoriously bad at the start. He didn't actually have that instantaneous, flawless burst right out of the gate that a true sprinter needs to establish dominance. And second, he wasn't fast enough to sustain a true elite sprint-level tempo.
So he wasn't even technically fast enough to be a sprinter. That makes his runaway style even more baffling.
Exactly. If they had put him in short-distance sprint races, he would have been swallowed up by the pack almost immediately because the true sprinters would have out-accelerated him from the jump. And we already know what happens when he gets swallowed by the pack.
His nerves take over.
Yes, the claustrophobia sets in, and he completely falls apart.
So the 2,000-meter distance wasn't a stubborn mistake by his trainers at all. It was a massive strategic necessity. It was his sweet spot.
It gave him exactly what he needed.
Middle distances gave him the runway. Because the other horses were pacing themselves for a longer race, Twin Turbo could use that early stretch to build up his momentum, stretch the field, and create that massive separation before the genuinely faster horses fully engaged their top gear.
And that dynamic is exactly what created the visual shock of his strategy. You have to picture this tiny 410-kilogram horse.
Which is really small for a thoroughbred.
Quite small and fragile looking. You have to picture him just opening up this staggering gap ahead of much larger elite runners.
And that visual shock translated directly into crowd energy. The roar of the crowd would organically grow as they suddenly realized just how far ahead he had gone. Watching Twin Turbo wasn't about appreciating efficiency or perfect mechanics or the elegance of a well-timed late charge. It was entirely about emotion.
Pure emotion.
It was about watching this small, physically outmatched horse pour literally every single ounce of energy he had into one desperate gamble.
And the crowd respected the honesty of that gamble. You mentioned earlier how his races were terrible for bettors. It is true, he was incredibly unreliable if you were looking for a safe return on your money. But from a purely emotional standpoint, he gave the audience something rare.
Yeah.
When he hit the final turn and the pack started closing in, the tension was palpable. You could see him physically emptying the tank. When it worked, it felt like a miracle. When it failed and the larger horses swarmed past him while he shifted into reverse, it was heartbreaking. But either way, you remembered it. You couldn't forget watching a competitor leave it all out there on the track.
So what does this all mean? When we look at all the facts, we have a horse who wasn't dominant, he wasn't polished, he wasn't even remotely consistent. But he was honest. He ran the only way he knew how to run, without a single ounce of calculation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains exactly why, decades later, Twin Turbo still lives in the hearts of fans. Twin Turbo is refreshing because he is the antithesis of optimization.
He really is.
He had one incredibly flawed strategy born out of a severe psychological limitation, and he committed to it to the bitter end. He didn't know how to calculate odds. He didn't know how to pace himself for maximum efficiency. He only knew how to run, and he never gave up on that one method, even when it led to spectacular defeat.
That unyielding commitment to his only available path was enough to make him unforgettable.
His legacy isn't built on trophies. It is built on the indelible memories he gave to the people watching him.
We just learned that Twin Turbo's legendary all-or-nothing style was entirely born out of deep fear and physical limitations, yet it made him immortal.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more.